The day she asked me, I felt like the ground beneath me shifted. It wasn't something I had ever imagined hearing from her. My wife, the woman I had built my life with, suddenly said she needed one night with her ex to find clarity. The request was simple, but the weight of it felt suffocating. I remember the words hitting me like a ton of bricks, my mind racing to understand what she meant by clarity, and more importantly, why she felt she needed to turn to him for it. We had been married for 5 years, a journey full of love, laughter, challenges, and dreams shared. We created a life together, a comfortable, predictable life where we knew each other's rhythms and routines. But recently, I had sensed a change in her. She had become distant, quieter, and I couldn't pinpoint when or why it started. I'd noticed the small things, the way she seemed lost in thought more often, how her attention wandered when we were together, and how she wasn't as present as she used to be. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong, telling myself it was just a phase, something we worked through like we had before. But when she spoke those words, I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't just a phase, it was something much deeper. She explained it like it was a reasonable request, something she needed to do for herself. She said that seeing her ex would help her sort through her feelings, give her the space to understand what she truly wanted. It wasn't about him, she reassured me. It was about her and finding her way back to clarity. I didn't know what to feel at that moment. Part of me wanted to say no, to fight for us, for our marriage. But another part of me, a part that felt weak and unsure, simply nodded. I agreed, not because I was okay with it, but because I thought it was the right thing to do. I told myself that giving her this space might allow her to come back and see things more clearly. But deep down, I knew I was giving her something far more dangerous than I realized. The freedom to make decisions that would change everything. I wasn't prepared for the storm that was about to hit. As she left, I felt a strange mix of confusion and betrayal. I wanted to trust her, but something in me screamed that I was setting myself up for heartache. I couldn't shake the thought that if she needed this night with him to feel sure, maybe I wasn't enough. I spent the next few days in a whirlwind of emotions, wondering what would happen next, and if I could handle whatever came. The uncertainty began to eat at me, but it was only the beginning of the long road ahead, a road that would ultimately lead me to a place I never expected. It was an ordinary evening, or so it seemed, when the conversation started. We had been sitting on the couch, wrapped in the comfort of silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. The familiar hum of the TV played softly in the background, and I could feel her beside me. But at the same time, it felt like she was miles away. I had sensed it for a while, this growing distance between us. Little by little, she had become more withdrawn, more quiet. She smiled less, and her eyes, which had once sparkled with excitement, were now often clouded with something I couldn't quite grasp. At first, I told myself it was just stress, maybe something to do with work or the mundane pressures of daily life. But as time went on, the tension between us became undeniable. We had grown comfortable, yes, but it felt more like we were coexisting than truly living together. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure what it was, or why it had happened. It was then that she said it. She turned toward me, her gaze steady but filled with uncertainty, and asked, "What if I took one night to see him, just to find some clarity?" For a moment, I couldn't process the words. Him. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. I had always known about her past relationship with her ex, but I never thought it would come up like this. Not in a way that would force me to question everything. "Yes," she said softly. "I need to see him. It's not about him, really. It's about me. I need to be sure of what I want, of what I feel." I felt like the room had gone silent, even though the TV was still playing in the background. Her words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't make sense of them. "What do you mean by clarity? Why him?" These were the questions that ran through my head, but they never made it past my lips. Instead, I stared at her, unsure what to say, unable to fathom the weight of her request. She explained that it wasn't about rekindling anything with her ex, that this wasn't some desperate attempt to go back to her past. She simply needed to confront her feelings, and, she said, this was the only way to do it. She promised me that it wasn't a test of our relationship, but rather a way for her to gain perspective on what was missing or unclear in her heart. As she spoke, my mind raced, but my body stayed frozen. I didn't know what to do with the words she was giving me. Part of me wanted to argue, to tell her that this was crazy, that if she needed clarity, we should figure it out together. But the other part of me, the part that was scared of losing her, stayed quiet. Was I supposed to trust her? Was I supposed to believe that this wasn't a sign of something deeper, something that might break us apart? She waited for my response, her eyes full of hope, and that's when I realized she had already made up her mind. This wasn't a conversation about options. It was about her needing something that I didn't fully understand. My heart screamed to say no, to tell her that this wasn't right, that I couldn't just let her walk out that door. But instead, I nodded. I told her, if you think this will help you, then I won't stop you. In truth, I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing, but I had convinced myself that maybe this was what she needed: space, clarity, time away to figure out what she truly wanted. I convinced myself that giving her this freedom would somehow bring us back together, stronger than before. But deep down, I knew I was making a mistake. I didn't know it then, but that moment, that one simple request, would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The days that followed her request were nothing short of agonizing. Each moment felt stretched, like time itself was moving too slowly, taunting me with the uncertainty of what was to come. I spent the first couple of days in a daze, trying to convince myself that I had made the right decision, allowing her the space she claimed to need. I told myself I was being reasonable. This was her journey, her search for clarity, and who was I to stand in the way of that? But as the hours passed, the seed of doubt began to grow, and soon it was all I could think about. It wasn't just the idea of her spending a night with her ex that troubled me. It was the fact that she needed to do it at all. I kept running the conversation over my mind, trying to understand her reasons. Why couldn't she talk to me? Why didn't she feel that she could turn to me to find the answers she was looking for? I wanted to believe her when she said it wasn't about him, but deep down, I wondered if I was fooling myself. What if she just needed to feel the past again? What if she was looking for something I couldn't give her? It wasn't until the third night after she left that the reality of what was happening truly began to sink in. I sat on the couch, alone in the silence that had once felt comforting but now seemed unbearable. I kept telling myself I would be okay, that this was a temporary thing, just a blip on the radar of our relationship. But I could feel myself unraveling. The loneliness crept in slowly, then all at once. The space she had asked for felt less like a gift and more like a gulf that I couldn't cross. Every little thing reminded me of her. The sound of her laugh, the way she always left a coffee cup on the counter, the way she'd hum a song while doing dishes. Everything felt empty, and it was starting to break me. I began questioning everything. Did she really love me? Had I done something wrong? Was this just an excuse to leave me behind? I couldn't get the image out of my head. Her with him, reliving memories I wasn't part of. The thoughts haunted me, relentless and sharp. I tried to distract myself, work, friends, even spending time with family, but none of it helped. Nothing could fill the void that was growing wider inside of me. The turning point came one evening when I decided to call her. It had been a couple of days since I last heard from her, and I needed some kind of reassurance, something to hold on to. But when the phone rang and she picked up, her voice sounded different, distant, almost attached. She told me she was doing well, that she was finding the clarity she needed. She spoke about him in passing, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and that's when it hit me like a wave. I was no longer the center of her world. Whatever bond we had, whatever connection we once shared, had shifted, and in that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't ready to be with someone who didn't prioritize me, who needed someone else to make sense of their life. I didn't want to admit it at first, but the truth was clear. I was losing her. I could feel it slipping away, no matter how hard I tried to hold on. I had spent years building a life with this woman, trusting her, loving her, and now she was asking for space not just physically but emotionally, and I had to face it. No matter how much it hurt, I couldn't be with someone who wasn't fully present in our relationship anymore. If she needed this time apart to find clarity, then I had to find my own clarity too. And that clarity was telling me that this relationship wasn't healthy anymore. I don't know exactly when I made a decision, but it came with a quiet finality. I couldn't keep waiting, couldn't keep pretending that everything would return to normal once she figured it out. The hurt was too deep now, and the distance between us had become too vast a bridge. The next morning, I started packing. I didn't know what I was going to do or where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. The house felt too empty, too full of memories of her, of us. I knew I had to leave, not just the house, but everything, the life we had built together. I couldn't wait for her to come back and make a decision about me. I couldn't keep living in a state of uncertainty, holding on to someone who was already slipping away. When she returned a few hours later, I was gone. I left a note, simple and honest. I can't wait any longer. I'm walking away. I hope you find what you're looking for, but I can't be a part of this anymore. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. In fact, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. But I knew, deep down, that I couldn't keep giving her space to figure things out while ignoring the toll it was taking on me. It was time for me to walk away, not just from her, but from the version of myself that had been holding on to someone who was no longer there. And as I left, I didn't know what the future would hold. But I knew one thing for sure. I had finally taken control of my own life. Leaving was harder than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just a physical act of walking out the door. It was everything that came with it. The emotions, the memories, the shared life that I was leaving behind. As I packed my things, the silence in the house was suffocating. I could almost feel her presence in every corner, in every room we had built together. I kept telling myself that I was doing the right thing, but the weight of the decision was heavy, and I couldn't shake the doubt. I knew I had to do this. I knew that by walking away, I was taking back control of my life. But that didn't make it any easier. I had spent so many years building a future with her, and now I was walking away from it all. The person I thought I would grow old with, the woman who had once been my everything, was now a stranger. I wasn't even sure what I was walking toward. There was no clear path, no certainty that I would ever find someone else, or that I would ever feel that way again. But that's what hurt the most. It wasn't just a fear of being alone. It was the pain of realizing that what I had once thought was love had transformed into something else. What had started as a bond so strong, so secure, was now fragile, uncertain. And the truth was, she wasn't coming back to me. She had asked for space to find clarity, but what she really needed was something I couldn't give her anymore. And in that moment, I had to face the truth that it was over. As I drove away from the house, the city felt unfamiliar. It was as if everything around me had shifted, but I hadn't yet caught up. I tried not to think about her, but she was everywhere, in the places we had been, in the memories we had created. I could still picture her smile, the way her voice sounded when she laughed, the way she held me close when she was tired or afraid. But all those little things, the ones that used to make me feel safe, now felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who had already moved on. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to go somewhere, anywhere but back. I ended up at a small apartment in the city, a place that felt far removed from everything I had known. It was nothing special, just a small, empty space. But it was mine. I could breathe here. I didn't have to worry about her, about us, about the constant weight of questions and uncertainty. For the first time in days, I felt the tiniest sense of relief. But relief didn't come without its price. As I settled into my new life, I found myself questioning everything. What if I had made a mistake? What if I had overreacted? What if she came back, apologized, and wanted to make it work? The thought lingered in the back of my mind, even though I knew deep down that I had done the right thing. She had made her choice when she asked for that night with her ex, and I couldn't wait around anymore for her to figure things out. I had to put myself first, even if it meant walking away from the love of my life. The first few days in my new place were a blur. I spent most of my time unpacking, trying to fill the emptiness with activity. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the pain never fully went away. There were moments when I found myself staring out the window, wondering what she was doing, where she was, if she was thinking of me. But those thoughts were fleeting. Slowly, I began to accept that I wasn't just walking away from her. I was walking away from the version of myself that had been so wrapped up in her and in our life together. I had to learn to be my own person again, to stop defining myself by the relationship we had. A week passed, and then another. I began to feel a sense of peace, though it was a quiet, tentative kind of peace. I started to reconnect with old friends, things I had neglected during our time together. I picked up hobbies I had once enjoyed, things I hadn't done in years. I could feel myself returning to the person I had been before I lost myself in the relationship. I wasn't completely healed, but I was starting to see the possibility of a life without her, a life that wasn't centered around her needs or her doubts, but mine. And that was when I realized something important. Walking away didn't just mean leaving her behind. It meant finally choosing myself. For so long, I had been second-guessing my worth, wondering if I was enough for her, if I was good enough for anyone. But in leaving, I was making a statement. I was enough. I didn't need her to validate me. I didn't need anyone to tell me that I was worthy. I was worthy of love, of respect, of happiness, on my own terms. A few months later, she called. I didn't pick up at first. I wasn't sure I was ready for that conversation. But when I finally listened to the message, I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the regret. She apologized, saying she had been wrong to ask for space in the way she had. She said she missed me, that she was ready to work things out. But by then, I had already made my decision. I wasn't the same person I had been when I walked away. I had found myself again, and I wasn't willing to lose that part of me. I had chosen to move forward, to walk away forever, not because I hated her, but because I loved myself enough to let go. I never called her back. In the weeks that followed, life became a mix of painful growth and unexpected relief. The initial shock of leaving my marriage had felt like an emotional earthquake, shaking the very foundation of who I was. But as time passed, the dust began to settle, and I started to realize something important. I had been holding my breath for too long, and now I could finally exhale. At first, I had no idea how to navigate this new chapter. I spent my days in the quiet, small apartment I had rented, surrounded by boxes and memories I hadn't fully unpacked. There were times when I couldn't shake the feeling of loneliness that crept in. The silence of the apartment felt overwhelming, especially at night when the memories of her flooded my thoughts. I found myself staring out the window for hours, trying to make sense of everything. The house I had left behind, the life I thought I'd built, it all seemed so distant, as if it belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. But slowly I began to see the shift. What had initially felt like an unbearable emptiness started to become a space I could breathe in. I had to learn how to live alone again, to embrace solitude not as a curse, but as a chance to rediscover who I was outside of the relationship. The first time I went out for a walk without her beside me, I was overwhelmed by the stillness of it all. But then, I started noticing things I hadn't seen before, the way the sunlight hit the trees, the sound of the city, the simple joy of being on my own terms. The world hadn't stopped because I had walked away from my marriage. It was still turning, and I was still here, breathing, living, figuring out what came next. I threw myself into work to keep my mind occupied. There were days when the loneliness became too much to handle, but I pushed through. I began taking on more projects, putting in longer hours, and making new connections with colleagues. It wasn't just about work. It was about finding something to focus on that wasn't tied to the past. In some strange way, I felt proud of myself. I was doing it. I was rebuilding. But it wasn't all about work. I started doing things I hadn't done in years. I went to the gym again, something I had put off for too long while I had been focused on her, on us. I began reading books I had always wanted to explore, but had never made the time for. I started cooking again, something I had always enjoyed but had neglected. Little by little, I started to reclaim parts of myself I had abandoned in the name of compromise and sacrifice. I learned that I didn't need to give up my passions to be a good partner. In fact, I had been better when I nurtured myself, when I allowed myself to exist outside of my role as a husband. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. There were moments when I questioned myself. What if I had made a mistake? What if she had really changed? What if there was a chance for us to rebuild? These questions haunted me in the quiet moments, and I found myself wrestling with them late at night. I missed her at times. Her laughter, the way she would curl up on the couch next to me, the comfort of having someone there. It wasn't the relationship I missed, though. It was the idea of it, the version of us that had once felt so real and unbreakable. One night, a few months after I had left, I found myself scrolling through my phone, looking at old pictures of the two of us. I had never deleted any of them, even though part of me wanted to. The memories were beautiful, but they were also painful. The smiles, the trips we had taken, the moments that once felt like the peak of happiness. Now they felt like echoes of a life that no longer existed. I looked at the photos, feeling a mix of nostalgia and grief. It was hard to accept, but I knew that the version of us in those photos was gone. We were no longer the people we had been in those moments. And I was no longer the person I was when I was with her. It was around that time that I realized something vital. I had been grieving not just the loss of the marriage, but the loss of the person I thought I was. I had spent so much time focusing on us, on making her happy, on doing what I thought was right, that I had forgotten who I was without all of that. It was liberating to finally accept that I wasn't defined by the relationship. I was defined by my choices, my values, my passions, and the life I was creating from scratch. The healing process was slow, but it was steady. I began meeting new people, forming new friendships that weren't tainted by the past. There was a sense of freedom in being able to connect with others without the weight of old baggage. I found myself laughing again, truly laughing, not out of obligation or in an attempt to fill the silence, but because I genuinely enjoyed the company of others. In some ways, I had started to become a new version of myself, someone who was strong, independent, and, most importantly, whole. It wasn't about finding someone else to replace her. It was about rediscovering my own worth. The idea of love still seemed complicated, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to dive back into another relationship. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. I realized that sometimes walking away isn't about rejecting the other person. It's about rejecting the version of yourself that you've lost along the way. And in walking away, I had found myself again. I had walked away forever, not just from a relationship, but from the person I had become because of it. And in doing so, I had found the person I was always meant to be. There are no guarantees, no promises about what would come next. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. I had taken control of my own destiny. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Moving on after the decision to leave was harder than I had expected, but it was also the most liberating thing I had ever done. The days following my departure from the marriage were filled with an uncertain but hopeful silence. At first, it felt like I was treading water, drifting without a clear direction, unsure where I was headed. But with each passing day, I began to realize that I wasn't drifting at all. I was finding my way. The first few months were about building new habits, creating a life that was entirely my own. I started to embrace the freedom that came with living alone, something I had never truly experienced before. I no longer had to consider anyone else's schedule, needs, or emotions when making decisions. For the first time in a long while, I didn't have to compromise or suppress my own desires. The space was mine to fill however I chose. I began to focus on things I had neglected during my marriage, things that had once brought me joy. I picked up a guitar again, something I hadn't done in years. Music had always been my escape, but somewhere along the way, I had stopped making time for it. Now, it was the soundtrack to my healing process. I reconnected with old friends, the ones I hadn't seen in ages because I had been so absorbed in the relationship. It felt good to laugh without guilt, to share stories and memories that didn't revolve around the marriage. Slowly, I was rediscovering the parts of myself I had lost in the years of compromise and sacrifice. There were moments, of course, when the loneliness crept in. I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss her at times. The way she'd smile when she entered the room, the little rituals we shared. But I no longer missed a version of us that had become toxic, the one that had been defined by distance and uncertainty. What I missed was the hope that things could have been different. But deep down, I knew I couldn't hold on to something that wasn't meant for me anymore. I started taking risks in other areas of my life, too. I traveled more, something I had always wanted to do, but had put off because it didn't fit into the plans we had made together. I met new people, some of whom became close friends, others who simply reminded me that life was still full of possibilities. The world felt bigger now, and I was no longer confined to the small box I had built around myself in the relationship. As the months went by, I realized that I had grown stronger, more resilient, and more self-aware. I had faced my deepest fears of being alone, of being unworthy, of losing someone I loved, and I had survived. More than that, I had thrived. I was no longer afraid of being on my own. In fact, I was beginning to enjoy it. The weight of the past had lifted, and I was starting to see life through a clearer lens. I had learned that my worth was not tied to anyone else's approval, and that was incredibly empowering. I thought about the future often, but it wasn't the way I had imagined it before. I wasn't waiting for someone to come into my life and fill the emptiness. I was learning to fill that space on my own. I was no longer looking for someone to complete me. I was learning to complete myself. And that was the most important lesson I could have learned. Love, I realized, isn't about dependence or finding someone to make up for what's missing. It's about two whole individuals coming together, each bringing their own experiences, strengths, and dreams to the table. I wasn't looking for someone to save me anymore. I was looking for someone who would walk alongside me, who would respect my independence and my journey, just as I would respect theirs. Though I had left the relationship behind, I didn't harbor any bitterness. I had forgiven her, and more importantly, I had forgiven myself. I had learned that some relationships aren't meant to last forever, and that doesn't diminish the love or the value of what was shared. Sometimes, walking away is the only way to preserve what is truly important, your own sense of self. I wasn't sure what the future held, and I no longer felt the need to know. I was open to whatever life had in store for me, but I was also content with where I was. For the first time in a long time, I was living for myself, not for anyone else, and in that I had found peace. Moving on wasn't easy, but it was worth it. The future felt less like a series of questions and more like an open road, full of potential and possibilities. I was no longer afraid of what was to come. I was ready to face it, whatever it might be, with a heart full of hope and a life that was mine to create. Looking back on everything, I realized that walking away was not just a decision. It was a pivotal moment of self-liberation. It was a moment I stopped living for someone else's approval, for their version of what life should be, and started living for myself. At the time, I didn't know how far-reaching this choice would be. I didn't know that leaving would teach me the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, you have to let go of something in order to find yourself again. The journey wasn't easy. It was filled with moments of doubt, moments when I questioned whether I had made the right choice. There were days when the loneliness felt unbearable, and I longed for the comfort of the life I had known. But over time, I began to see that the life I had been living wasn't serving me. It was holding me back from discovering who I truly was and what I was capable of achieving on my own. In the months following, I learned how to embrace solitude, how to rediscover my passions, and how to rebuild my life from the ground up. I began to focus on my personal growth, something I had neglected for too long. And in doing so, I found strength in places I never knew existed. I reconnected with old friends, pursued new interests, and slowly began to piece together the person I had once been before I lost myself in the roles of partner and spouse. I learned that I was enough, just as I was. As time passed, the pain of walking away started to fade, replaced by a sense of freedom and peace. I realized that the decision to leave wasn't about rejecting her or our past. It was about choosing myself. It was about acknowledging that sometimes the best way to love someone is to let them go, and in doing so, giving both people the opportunity to grow. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. I'm no longer afraid of it. I'm no longer bound by the past, and I'm finally ready to face whatever comes with a heart open to new possibilities. Life after that decision is uncertain, but it is mine to shape, and that makes all the difference.